We are your home theater and AV questions answered. This is AVRant. Want your home theater or AV question answered by Tom and Rob? Send it to question@avrant.com. Welcome to AVRant. I'm Tom Andry, and I'm here with
Rob H.
Ted. All right, once again, thank you, Ted, for a couple of weeks ago, your Gambit that got a lot of people donating to the podcast. That was fantastic. Thank you, Ted. He's got an update on his legacy audio silhouettes. First of all, they're huge. He's got a picture here, which I'm sure Rob is showing on the YouTube channel, even as we speak. The big speakers are the new ones, the legacy audios, and the itty bitty ones are the depth techs, or the ones he was using before. So
right.
He's probably going, oh my God.
There is more surface area here to produce sound.
A little bit. So secondly, that was first. Secondly, they sound great. They sound clean at unbearable volume levels, which is probably like 2 watts. Audyssey crosses them over at 60 hertz compared to 200 hertz with this depth text, which has made his sub sound much cleaner. And the mid-range reminds him of his Oppo PM3 headphones, although they may boost it a little with EQ. He may eventually play with the EQ. Overall, they're better than either the M&Ks or the Totem Tribe 3s he auditioned. The bad news is he's having trouble with placement. When he places the right and left speakers to form an equilateral triangle with the seat, the soundstage is wide and cinema-like. But when he cinema-like, I think I said light. But when sounds pan far to either side, they sound like they're way over there and detached from the content on the screen. If he moves them closer to the display, it solves the detachment problem, but also narrows the soundstage, and it no longer sounds like a real theater. He's fairly certain that part of the issue is that he bought 3 vertical speakers, since one day he'll have them behind an acoustically transparent screen. But for now, he's simply turned one used as a center on its side. This means that the folded ribbon tweeter is horizontal rather than vertical. So would he be correct to assume that his center currently has very tall vertical dispersion but narrow horizontal dispersion?
That most likely is the case.
That would make sense. That would make perfect sense if you think about it, because ribbon tweeters, they're built to have good horizontal but not so great vertical dispersion. So when you turn on its side, you've just reoriented 90 degrees, and of course that's what you're going to.
But that aside, that wouldn't affect what you're hearing, where if something is hard panned into just the front left speaker and it's, you've put it wide from the screen so it sounds like it's way over there and off the screen. Yeah. Your center speaker isn't going to affect that, because you're hearing that because the left speaker is way over there and you're noticing that it's way over there.
Right.
So yeah, this when it's a hard pan, it's not going to affect that. When it's something that's transitioning, it's panning across, going from left to center to right or vice versa. There you might
speaker to speaker.
Yeah, you might notice that there's a gap type of sound in between it. That would make sense if you have
this just seems
narrow.
Like something he just needs to kind of inch him in a little bit, here and there.
Yeah, but he was saying that, like, if you put them right beside the screen, then all of the sounds sounded locked to the screen, but then he didn't have a very wide sound stage. And then when he tried stuff in between, he never found like a good spot in between that sounded seamless. However, he has an update to all of that.
He called Legacy and spoke to Rob, one of their engineers, not you, a different dude. He
Not me.
told Ted to position the woofers of the mains at the same height as the woofer on the center, and they should image better. Ted was surprised to hear this advice, but tried it anyway, and it worked. Despite the tweeter of the center being 1 inch, or 1 foot below ear height, and the tweeters of the mains 1 foot above, the soundstage is much more cohesive than it was before. He was even able to widen the left and right positions to create a larger soundstage without severing sound from the action on screen like was happening before. Even the dialogue is improved. He's still confused, though. Why would aligning the woofers do what aligning the tweeters did not? I don't know. That's weird.
So there could be a couple of things at
Let me look
play
at these
here.
speakers here.
Yeah. So first of all, speaker designers can. It's not. I wouldn't say typical or usual, but you can design the output of a speaker in such a way that what you would call the acoustic center of the speaker which is basically like the point from which you get even dispersion, right? So you go above, below, to the left or the right of the acoustic center, that's where you get even dispersion. Normally, that's the tweeter. But not always. It's possible through careful use of driver selection and how you use the crossover between the tweeter and the mid-range driver to move the acoustic center closer to the mid-range driver, or above the tweeter, or something like that. It's possible to do that with careful design, and Legacy is certainly a speaker design company capable of doing something like that. So it seems as though maybe they moved the acoustic center of the speaker a little bit below the tweeter. They moved it closer to that mid-range driver, so that if you're having more of like the mid-range drivers or the woofers lined up, you're actually closer to the acoustic center. That is not impossible, and it would make sense. It would explain what's going on here. Normally, it's the tweeter, but it doesn't have to be. You can.
So he had the speakers lined up so that the tweeters were the center channel was in line with the tweeter. So where was the tweeter ear height wise? Because if it's at ear height, then the main speakers were lower than they should. That's right.
Before the main speakers were lower, so that their tweeters were at seated ear height, and then the center was still a little bit lower than that because he has his TV screen. Yeah. But what this Rob, an engineer from Legacy, said is no, actually even though you'll move the tweeters farther apart, they're now 2 feet apart vertically. But he was suggesting actually move the main speakers upward so that Ted's seated ears are closer to like the mid-range drivers or the woofers rather than the tweeters.
It might be an off. What you're saying about the acoustic center makes sense. Could also be that this particular tweeter sounds a little bit better off axis than it does directly on, which would explain why the acoustic center would be where it is. They may have lowered it because the off axis response is a little bit better. Yeah,
there actually is a thing that's fairly common with planar drivers. So that's, planar magnetics, electrostatics, and ribbons. There actually is a thing that's quite common amongst those drivers where the actual dead-on axis frequency response is less than ideal. But anywhere around that, a little bit off axis, is actually what the engineer was going for. That's not an uncommon thing with planar drivers. It wouldn't surprise me at all. Again, Legacy, a very good engineering company. They're aware of this type of thing. So it wouldn't surprise me if actually everywhere except dead on axis is where they actually have the frequency response they're going for. And if you are dead on axis, you're not quite getting the sound that they are hoping for you to hear. So all of that, I'm not saying that's the case, but none of it would surprise me if it were, because all of that is very plausible with this sort of design of a speaker.
And it also it speaks volumes for calling the manufacturer and saying, hey, where should I put your stupid speakers? Because a lot of times we can talk about generally where you should put speakers, but we have not heard every speaker on the planet. And we probably would have said ear height for the tweeters. Probably would have been
that is the typical advice, yeah.
But it's good to know that in this case, it's the placement is actually supposed to be different. Legacy's Rob also recommended EQing down the center above 8 kilohertz to help it not stick out after room correction is applied. So why should he need to do this? What would cause Audyssey to EQ the center too bright? We've talked about this before about how Audyssey does have slightly different curves for their straight or flat versus movie or whatever it is. I'm wondering if this has more to do with what they were talking about before. And how I don't know that room correction necessarily is doing anything, but he's just saying in general, if you've got that tweeter closer to ear level, which is, if you've raised your speakers up a little bit and it's down, and now your tweeter, that horizontal dispersion is a little bit different. He may just be saying that that's generally not a bad idea. If you can't place them all vertically the way we want you to, you might want to roll them off a little bit just so that you are hearing more of the sound the way that you're hearing it from the mains, which is actually rolled off slightly. And he's saying do it before or after room correction is applied, because if you do it before room correction is applied, room correction is going to fix it. Okay, that's what.
I actually think it's exactly what you said with the off-axis response. Because the center, if you've aligned it so the center is perfectly at ear height and it's dead ahead of you, you're getting the most direct on-axis sound you could possibly get. And he's saying, roll that off a bit. You know what? These are purpose-built on-wall speakers, or on-wall / in-wall, because I think you can do them as a hybrid too. But these are like purpose-built on-wall speakers. I really think it's very likely that Legacy said, these are purpose-built on-wall speakers. Most people are not going to be able to aim them to be perfectly on axis. So we're going to design it so that the off axis response is flat. But then if you're sitting perfectly on axis, it's actually too bright.
Right.
That makes a whole lot of sense to me. So this advice saying, because the center speaker is going to be the closest to being dead on axis, if you're dead on axis, it might sound too bright. Roll it off a bit. That'll be closer to the off axis response, which is what we actually want you to hear. Again, I'm speculating, but I think that's all very plausible.
Yeah. The greatness of the silhouettes has also shown him the weakness of his current subwoofer. So it's upgrade time. He's looking at the SVS, but the Rhythmic L22 has him curious. Man, this dude. I love Ted, man. He's my kind of guy. He really is. Anyway, he says, what's with dual driver subs? Is it true you get the same output for half the power? If so, high output is only needed in huge rooms, and in a huge room, why go with two 12s drivers inside of a sealed box instead of one 15-inch driver in a ported box if space is not an issue? Either way, does this matter to Ted since this room is not huge? The answer to the very last question is absolutely not. Stop looking at big subwoofers. They're sexy, and I understand, but you do not need it. You will not need it. You need to buy something much smaller, and you will get all the output that you need, all the base extension that you will ever want in your room, and save a ton of cash by doing it. And buy two. Yes, and still save money over one of these big
dual
ones.
subs. Yeah, no, the thing with dual driver subs, I mean, if it's a dual driver, it just means you have more surface area, right?
Just
You've
surface
doubled
area.
the surface area.
Yeah.
Which you could get a single larger diameter driver that has the same surface area. Now, you don't get more output for free. You've doubled the surface area. So normally where this comes up is in the whole DIY section, right?
Yeah.
Where people are like, you could get two of the same drivers, one of the same amp, get the box that holds the two drivers, and it's as if you got double the output for free. Well, that's not really true, because you've either halved the impedance by wiring them in parallel, in which case the amplifier, even if it's the same amplifier, it's now seeing half the impedance load, so it has to deliver twice the current. Or you have wired them in series, in which case you've doubled the impedance, which means you have to increase the voltage to get the same output. Right? So there's no free lunch here. You're not getting it for free. You can use the same amp as long as it can handle either half the impedance or requiring twice the voltage. That all works. You are doubling the surface area, so it is more efficient in that sense, but it's not different than just having a larger driver that has a diameter large enough to equal the same surface area. So no free lunch on that part. Why go with dual 12s instead of a single 15? Well, I guess you can make a taller, narrower sub, right? I mean,
there's a lot of reasons. I mean, there's cost of the drivers involved.
Absolutely.
All the stuff that goes into driver menu. How much material is going into your 15-inch driver, your 18-inch driver, versus your a couple of 12s. I mean, there's a lot of considerations that go in there.
With dual drivers in one box, you could do the dual opposed thing where they're firing to both sides, and therefore the cabinet doesn't shake as much because the movement cancels out sort of the vibration in the cabinet. There's lots of design considerations that go on here. But as far as for TED specifically, I mean, I highly recommend rhythmic subs. So if you prefer a rhythmic sub over an SVS sub for whatever reason, knock yourself out because you're getting a great subwoofer.
Right. But you don't need a big monster dual 12-inch driver subwoofer in your room.
No, not in yours.
You need two 12-inch subwoofers in your room, but not in the same box. In two different boxes in a diagonally opposed corners of your room, if at all possible. So he asks, what does a phase plug do? Now, if you're looking at his picture right here, I think he's got one in there, right? Yes.
Yes.
The mid-range driver there is obviously some sort of Kevlar, or they call it polywoven fabric, whatever. They're not supposed to cover that little. A lot of times they call it a bullet plug or a phase plug. It'll be like some sort of metal, and it stays stationary while the driver material goes in and out around it. What's the difference? Well, the other ones have a dust cap, which is basically sometimes it's inverted. The one at the very bottom, the driver at the very bottom there.
The woofer at the bottom there, yeah.
That one's it has a dust cap that's inverted, and that goes in and out with the driver material. The idea here, I actually sat down one time with Shane Rich at RBH, and we talked about it, and he basically said, it's just kind of some drivers have them, some drivers don't. It's a design thing. It does and he told me all the stuff it does. And we were drinking beer, so I don't remember any of it. But he told me all the stuff it does. And he's like, in the end, it's just sort of a design. It has, it's a design choice. It's what you're comfortable with. It's the kind of drivers that you've worked with before, the sound that you like, and you kind of choose that. So, I'm sorry, I can't be more.
One thing a phase plug does is decrease the surface area, because you don't have a dust cap that is also moving. You have less surface area that is actually moving. So in a sense, it is a less efficient driver because it just has less moving surface area, even though it covers the same surface area, but not all of that surface area is moving because there's
except if you have a fake phase plug, which they'll actually
like Paradigm does,
yeah, Paradigm has those where it looks like a phase plug, but it's actually just a thing that's attached to the woofer that goes in and out as well.
Dust cap.
Yeah, it's really weird that when they do that. I'm always like, you know what? If you're going to do that, just don't do it.
But the main reason to have a phase plug is when you start playing lower and lower frequencies, those frequencies start having longer and longer wavelengths. And eventually you get to a wavelength that is either the wavelength itself exceeds the diameter of the driver that's producing it, or a quarter of the wavelength is actually where this effect starts to come into play. So a quarter of the wavelength, whatever note you're playing, when that starts to get wider than the diameter of the driver itself, you start getting very directional dispersion. The cone itself starts to act as a horn, right? So you don't want to use a very wide driver to produce high frequencies, because then the whole driver is acting as a cone. It's acting as a horn. So that's why, tweeters are very small and woofers can be larger, because woofers are producing longer wavelengths. So, you know what? I'm thinking about it. I think I said that backwards. It's when the diameter of the cone exceeds the wavelength that you're producing. That's the proper way to say it.
So when it's up
diameter
high.
of the cone. Yeah. So the diameter of the cone is exceeding a quarter of the wavelength that it's producing. It starts to act as a horn. So when you put a phase plug in there, imagine that there's a sound wave that isn't just traveling, straight out of the cone. It's also traveling across the cone, right? So the right side of that driver is moving, and the sound wave is traveling across the cone itself over to the left side of the cone. Well, when you have a phase plug, it hits...
it
hits something in the middle to bounce off of. Yeah. So what it effectively does is it cuts the diameter of the woofer in half, which means that you can have that woofer play higher frequencies without starting to act like a horn. So that's why you most often see it in mid-range drivers. Because let's say you have a fairly large mid-range driver, like a 7-inch diameter mid-range driver, that's going to start to act like a horn at fairly low frequencies, maybe down at 2,000 hertz or so. It's starting to act like a horn, and maybe that's where your crossover is happening. You don't want that. You put a phase plug into that 7-inch diameter driver, and it's in effect very similar to now a 3.5-inch diameter driver as far as the dispersion is concerned. So it makes a lot of sense to use it in a mid-range driver, because it more or less cuts in half the diameter of the driver, so you don't get this horn effect.
And that's basically where you see them. You always, I can't think of a time I haven't seen them in a mid-range driver. It's always the mid-range.
Oh, it makes the most sense there by far, yeah.
And a lot of people just like them. They look cool,
sure,
honestly. And I think that there's that to me, from an aesthetic standpoint, if some manufacturer said, well, we just like the way they look, I'd be like, all right, that's cool. Because I look at a speaker and goes, oh, it's got a bullet plug. Cool. I mean, I know that's not... Sonically, I'm not really worried by it. It's a design choice, like Shane said, that was based on whether or not you designed your speaker to do certain things. And therefore, if your crossover is at such that we're crossing your tweeter over into your mid-range is such where what Rob has said is coming into play, well, you need something with the phase plug to make sure that you're not getting this horn effect. So... I guess we're getting off of speakers now. We're back on the other stuff with Ted. Is the Apple TV going to be left behind? So far, there's no support for Ultra HD or HDR or audio above Dolby Digital on the Apple TV or iTunes in general. So Ted has purchased over 60 movies from iTunes. Will they be stuck forever at 1080p SDR? The answer to that question, forever I don't know. But the ones you purchased, oh, absolutely yes. You were never going to get those things. They're never just going to say,
buying a...
Yeah, they never.
Yeah.
Apple is never going to contact you and say, "Yo, look, you bought all this great stuff. We just we now have Blu-ray versions of this or 4K versions of this or something like that. If you want that, all you have to do is click on this and it will upgrade your entire thing for you." Ain't never going to happen, Haas. Not with Apple.
They might give you pay us an extra couple of dollars and we'll give you the new version.
Yes.
I mean, there's nothing stopping Apple from starting to offer 4K and HDR content through iTunes. Of course, they could do that if they want to.
Absolutely.
And eventually they will. I mean, they're always late behind. Personally, I'm really ticked off at Apple right now. I think almost everything decision they're making as far as their hardware and their stupid port connections and stuff goes is terrible. Their fastest growing market is dongles, and that's never a good thing, so nuts to them. I'm really not a fan of Apple anymore with what they're doing. But yeah, there's nothing stopping them from starting to offer new content through iTunes. They can, of course, release a new Apple TV that supports 4K and HDR. Just, Roku
I'm sure
beat
they
them
will.
to it, Chromecast beat them to it, but yeah, eventually they will, sure.
I'm sure they will. And when they do, that's when they'll say, oh, okay, we've also upgraded iTunes to 4K. Now you can have 4K versions of all this stuff. And if you already have a movie that you bought through iTunes, we will, for a certain period of time. I mean, didn't they do that with their Apple, whatever it was, mastered for Apple or whatever? Didn't they have like the match program where you could take and if you if you had
already
music,
had downloaded music, and you paid a fee.
Yes.
So, sure. Yeah. But
they'll
probably release a 4K Apple TV that has a Thunderbolt connection on it, so you have to buy one of their Thunderbolt to HDMI cables, because that seems to be their business now. That's what they learned from buying Beats Audio. They're like, hey, we can charge exorbitant amounts of money for cables, because apparently everyone who buys our products is stupid, or we think they are. So
Absolutely.
Nuts to Apple. Screw them right now.
And I guess their new computers have gotten rid of the function keys now? Is that what I'm led to believe?
Yeah.
All the
They got a
function keys are gone?
little OLED touch strip, no more function keys, no more ports that anybody uses except for them. So, yeah. Awful.
I'm glad I got my computer when I did, because yes. All right. I guess I'll have to be switching back to PCs again. My wife will be excited. So again, he asks, can we explain why Audyssey's flat curve sounds almost too bright, even though it's supposed to be neutral? Something to do with direct and reflected sound? ? No, not necessarily. I mean, you've chosen flat, and what's the other option is usually movie, right?
Yeah, movie or the Audyssey curve or reference curve, whatever the name they've given it to it, but they usually just have two choices there. The Audyssey or movie curve does roll off the highs. That is one thing.
That's right. So, I mean, why does it sound almost too bright? Well, because your speakers are very, very revealing and you're not used to it. To be honest with you, that's what it kind of comes down to. Your other speakers rolled it off for you, and therefore Audyssey's flat curve gave them as much information as they could handle, and they just kind of petered out at the end. Well, your new speakers are able to reproduce all of that, and now it sounds, you're like, whoa, that's a lot of information I wasn't expecting that's up there. So if you don't like it, go with
switch
the other
over
one.
to the Audyssey curve. I mean, Audyssey didn't create their movie curve and make it the default by accident.
Yeah.
They're like, if you have very neutral, revealing, flat frequency response speakers, you might prefer a slight roll off in the highs. In fact, most people do. So there's nothing wrong with that. They didn't do that by accident.
No, they're not adding. That flat curve is not adding something. That's the whole idea of flat. Is it just giving you what's on the disc? You've just never heard it before. Welcome to the world. There's this new world of audio that you didn't know existed. This is literally it. This is stuff that you did not know was up there, and now it sounds weird because it's like, wait a second, I've never heard this stuff before, and that's what it is. So if you don't like it, that's fine. I will at least live with it a little bit and see if you can kind of get used to it or whatever. But if you don't like it, just turn on the movie mode or whatever the Audyssey other one is, and go with that.
Absolutely.
Want your question answered? Send it to question@avrant.com. This is AVRant.
Now go out and listen to something.